It was a steamingly hot July night, the Nile that year having experienced one of those floodings that occur once every 20 or 30 years and become legendary, something for fathers to talk to their sons about. Water covered most of the land lying between the river bank and the edge of the desert where the houses stood, and the fields became like islands amidst the water. The men moved between the houses and the fields in small boats or covered the distance swimming. Mustafa Saeed was, as far as I knew, an excellent swimmer. My father told me, for I was in Khartoum at the time, that they heard women screaming in the quarter after the evening prayers, and on hurrying to the source of the sound, had found that the screaming was coming from Mustafa Saeed's house. Though he was in the habit of returning from the fields at sunset, his wife had waited for him in vain. On asking about him here and there, she was told he had been seen in his field, though some thought he had returned home with the rest of the men. The whole village, carrying lamps, combed the river bank, while some put out in boats, but though they searched the whole night through, it was without avail. Telephone messages were sent to the police stations right along the Nile as far as Karma, but Mustafa Said's body was not among those washed up on the river bank that week. In the end, they presumed he must have been drowned and that his body had come to rest in the bellies of the crocodiles infesting the water. As for me, I am sometimes seized by the feeling which came over me that night when suddenly, and without my being at all prepared for it, I had heard him quoting English poetry, a drink in his hand, his body buried deep in his chair, his legs outstretched, the light reflected on his face, his eyes, it seemed to me, abstractedly wandering towards the horizon deep within himself, and with darkness all around us outside as though satanic forces were combining to strangle the lamplight. Occasionally, the disturbing thought occurs to me that Mustafa Saeed never happened, that he was, in fact, a lie, a phantom, a dream or a nightmare that had come to the people of that village one suffocatingly dark night, and when they opened their eyes to the sunlight, he was nowhere to be seen. Only the lesser part of the night still remained when I had left Mustafa Saeed's house. I left with a feeling of tiredness, perhaps due to having sat for so long. Yet, having no desire to sleep, I wandered off into the narrow winding lanes of the village, my face touched by the cold night breezes that blow in heavy with dew from the north, heavy too with the scent of acacia blossom and animal dung, the scent of earth that has just been irrigated after the thirst of days, and the scent of half-ripe corn cobs and the aroma of lemon trees. The village was, as usual, silent at that hour of the night except for the puttering of the water pump on the bank, the occasional barking of a dog, and the crowing of a lone cock who prematurely sensed the arrival of the dawn, and the answering crow of another. Then silence reigned. Passing by Wad Rayez's low-lying house at the bend in the lane, I saw a dim light coming from the small window and heard his wife give a cry of pleasure. I felt ashamed at having been privy to something I shouldn't have been. It wasn't right of me to stay awake wandering around the streets while everyone else was asleep in bed. I know this village street by street, house by house. I know, too, the domed shrines that stand in the middle of the cemetery on the edge of the desert high at the top of the village. The graves, too, I know one by one, having visited them with my father and mother and with my grandfather. I know those who inhabit these graves, both those who died before my father was born and those who have died since my birth. I have walked in more than 100 funeral processions, have helped with the digging of the grave, and have stood alongside it in a crush of people as the dead man was cushioned around with stones and the earth heaped in over him. I have done this in the early mornings, in the intensity of the noonday heat, in the summer months, and at night with lamps in our hands. I have known the fields too, ever since the days when there were water wheels and the times of drought when the men forsook the fields, and when the fertile land stretching from the edge of the desert where the houses stood to the bank of the Nile was turned into a barren, wind-swept wilderness. Then came the water pumps, followed by the cooperative societies, and those men who had migrated came back. The land returned to its former state, producing maize in summer and wheat in winter. All this I had been a witness to ever since I opened my eyes on life, yet I had never seen the village at such a late hour of the night. No doubt that large, brilliantly blue star was the morning star. At such an hour, just before dawn, the sky seemed nearer to the earth, and the village was enveloped in a hazy light that gave it the look of being suspended between earth and sky. As I crossed the patch of sand that separates the house of Wad Rayas from that of my grandfather, I remembered the picture that Mustafa Saeed had depicted. Remembered it with the same feeling of embarrassment as came to me when I overheard the love play of Wad Rayas with his wife. Two thighs opened wide and white. I reached the door of my grandfather's house and heard him reading his collect in preparation for the morning prayers. Doesn't he ever sleep? My grandfather's voice praying was the last sound I heard before I went to sleep, and the first I heard on waking. He had been like this for I don't know how many years, as though he were something immutable in the dynamic world. Suddenly, I felt my spirits being reinvigorated, as sometimes happens after a long period of depression. My brain cleared, and the black thoughts stirred up by the story of Mustafa Saeed were dispersed. Now the village was not suspended between sky and earth, but was stable. The houses were houses, the trees, trees, and the sky was clear and far away. Was it likely that what happened to Mustafa Saeed could have happened to me? He had said that he was a lie. So was I also a lie? I am from here. Is not this reality enough? I too had lived with them, but I had lived with them superficially, neither loving nor hating them. I used to treasure within me the image of this little village, seeing it wherever I went with the eye of my imagination. Sometimes during the summer months in London, after a downpour of rain, I would breathe in the smell of it, and at odd fleeting moments before sunset, I would see it. At the latter end of the night, the foreign voices would reach my ears as though they were those of my people out here. I must be one of those birds that exist only in one region of the world. True, I studied poetry, but that means nothing. I could equally well have studied engineering, agriculture, or medicine. They're all means to earning a living. I would imagine the faces over here as being brown or black so that they would look like the faces of people I knew. Over there is like here, neither better nor worse. But I am from here, just as the date palm standing in the courtyard of our house has grown in our house and not in anyone else's. The fact that they came to our land, I know not why. Does that mean that we should poison our present and our future? Sooner or later they will leave our country, just as many people throughout history left many countries. The railways, ships, hospitals, factories, and schools will be ours, and will speak their language without either a sense of guilt or a sense of gratitude. Once again, we shall be as we were, ordinary people, and if we are lies, we shall be lies of our own making. Such thoughts accompanied me to my bed and thereafter to Khartoum, where I took up my work in the Department of Education. Mustafa Saeed died 2 years ago, but I still continued to meet up with him from time to time. I lived for 25 years without having heard of him or seen him. Then all of a sudden, I find him in a place where the likes of him are not usually encountered. Thus Mustafa Saeed has, against my will, become a part of my world, a thought in my brain, a phantom that does not want to take itself off. And thus too I experience a remote feeling of fear fear that it is just conceivable that simplicity is not everything. Mustafa Saeed said that my grandfather knows the secret. A tree grows simply, and your grandfather has lived and will die simply. Just like that. But suppose he was making fun of my simplicity. On a train journey between Khartoum and Al Ubaid, I traveled in the same compartment with a retired civil servant. When the train moved out of Kosti, the conversation had brought us up to his school days. I learned from him that a number of my chiefs at the Ministry of Education were contemporaries of his at school, some having been in the same form with him. The man mentioned that so and so at the Ministry of Agriculture was a schoolmate of his, that such and such an engineer and in the form above him, that so and so, the merchant who had grown rich during the war years, had been the stupidest creature in the form, and that the famous surgeon so and so was the best right wing in the whole school at that time. Suddenly, I saw the man's face light up, his eyes sparkle as he said in an excited, animated voice, "How strange! Can you imagine? I quite forgot the most brilliant student in our form, and before now he's never come to my mind since he left school. Only now do I remember him. Yes, Mustafa Saeed." Once again, there was that feeling that the ordinary things before one's very eyes were becoming unordinary. I saw the carriage window and the door emerge, and it seemed to me that the light reflected from the man's glasses, in an instant that was no longer than the twinkling of an eye, gave off a dazzling flash, bright as the sun at its height. Certainly, the world at that moment appeared different also in relation to the retired Mamour in that complete experience. Outside his consciousness had suddenly come within his reach. When I first saw his face, I reckoned him to be in his middle 60s. Looking at him now as he continued to recount his faraway memories, I see a man who's not today over 40. Yes, Mustafa Saeed was the most brilliant student of our day. We were in the same form together, and he used to sit directly in front of our row on the left. How strange! How had he not come to my mind before, seeing that at that time he was a real prodigy? He was the most well-known student at Gordon College, better known than the members of the first 11, the prefects of the boarding houses, those who spoke at literary evenings, those who wrote in the wall newspapers, and the leading actors in the dramatic groups. He took part in none of these sorts of activities. Isolated and arrogant, he spent his time alone, either reading or going for long walks. We were all boarders in those days at Gordon College, even those of us who were from the three towns of Khartoum, Khartoum North, and Durman. He was brilliant at everything, nothing being too difficult for his amazing brain. The tone in which the masters addressed him was different from that in which they talked to us, especially the English language teachers. It was as though they were giving the lesson to him alone and excluding the rest of the students. The man was silent for a while, and I had a strong desire to tell him that I knew Mustafa Saeed, that circumstances had thrown him in my path, and that he had recounted his life story to me one dark and torrid night, that he had spent his last days in an obscure village at the bend of the Nile, that he had been drowned, had perhaps committed suicide, and that he had made me, of all people, guardian of his two sons. I said nothing, however, and it was the retired Mamour who continued. Mustafa Saeed covered his period of education in the Sudan at one bound, as if he were having a race with time. While we remained at Gordon College, he was sent on a scholarship to Cairo and later to London. He was the first Sudanese to be sent on a scholarship abroad. He was a spoiled child of the English, and we all envied him, expected he would achieve great things. We used to articulate English words as though they were Arabic and were unable to pronounce two consonants together without putting a vowel in between. Whereas Mustafa Saeed would contort his mouth and thrust out his lips, and the words would issue forth as though from the mouth of one whose mother tongue it was. This would fill us with annoyance and admiration at one and at the same time. With a combination of admiration and spite, we nicknamed him the Black Englishman. In our day, the English language was the key to the future. No one had a chance without it. Gordon College was actually little more than an intermediate school where they used to give us just enough education for filling junior government posts. When I left, I worked first as a cashier in the district of the fascia, and after strenuous efforts, they allowed me to sit for the administration examination. 30 years I spent as a sub-mamour. Imagine it. Just a mere 2 years before retirement, I was promoted to mamour. The English district commissioner was a god who had a free hand over an area larger than the whole of the British Isles and lived in an enormous palace full of servants and guarded by troops. They used to behave like gods. They would employ us, the junior government officials who were the natives of the country, to bring in the taxes. The people would grumble and complain to the English commissioner, and naturally it was the English commissioner who was indulgent and showed mercy. And in this way, they sowed hatred in the hearts of the people for us, their kinsmen, and love for the colonizers, the intruders. Mark these words of mine, my son. Has not the country become independent? Have we not become free men in our own country? Be sure, though, that they will direct our affairs from afar. This is because they have left behind them people who think as they do. They showed favor to non-entities, and it was such people that occupied the highest positions in the days of the English. We were certain that Mustafa Saeed would make his mark. His father was from the Abdaba, the tribe living between Egypt and the Sudan. It was they who helped Salatin Pasha escape when he was the prisoner of Khalifa al-Taishi, after which they worked as guides for Kitchener's army when he reconquered the Sudan. It is said that his mother was a slave from the south, from the tribes of Zandi or Baria. God knows. It was the nobodies who had the best jobs in the days of the English. The retired Mamour was snoring away fast asleep when the train passed by the Sennar Dam, which the English had built in 1925, heading westwards to Al Ubaid, on the single track stretching out across the desert like a rope bridge between two savage mountains, with a vast bottomless abyss between them. Poor Mustafa Saeed. He was supposed to make his mark in the world of commissioners and mamours, yet he hadn't even found himself a grave to rest his body in this land that stretches across 1,000,000 square miles. I remember his saying that before passing sentence on him at the Old Bailey, the judge had said, "Mr. Saeed, despite your academic prowess, you are a stupid man. In your spiritual makeup, there's a dark spot, and thus it was that you squandered the noblest gift that God had bestowed upon people, the gift of love." I remember too that when I emerged from Mustafa Saeed's house that night, the waning moon had risen to the height of a man on the eastern horizon, and that I had said to myself that the moon had had her talons clipped. I don't know why it looked to me as if the moon's talons had been clipped.